this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on UBI. For those who are not familiar with UBI, it is Universal Basic Income. And actually, it's kind of more relevant than ever right now. They've tested it out in the past in small samples, and they really didn't get much of a result because it was always in small examples and over a small term, like maybe a few months to up to a year. And what we're having right now with this whole coronavirus outbreak is, in a weird way, a test of the UBI system. Because what's happening is people are getting checks in the mail because they are not able to work. And it's a system where we're getting money in the mail, like, back when Andrew Yang was going on about it, he was talking about $1,000 a month. Well, what we're experiencing in Canada, for example, is the government is providing a subsidy for all people up to $2,000, and they're providing this money in order to compensate people for the fact that they are out of work. So it's kind of one of those situations where people are getting money from the government and having to make do on that money. That's not quite what UBI is, and I should really explain what UBI is. A typical way of thinking about UBI is the idea that the government does provide, usually it's about $1,000 per month. It's based on what amount of money would you need to give people everything that they basically need, basic needs like food, shelter, kind of rent. And the question is, the number that came up with is sort of like the bare minimum, which is about $1,000 per month. And that doesn't mean you can live in like the biggest city. No, you can only, you have to make that 1,000 too. And it would be money that's given to anyone above the age 18 is usually how people envision UBI. And the way people's would be taxed would be a flat rate tax after that. If you earn a certain amount of money, you get a flat rate tax, and that flat rate tax basically means that everybody has like equal amount of taxation instead of the progressive tax system that we have now, where the highest earners are actually paying the majority of the tax. That's one of the things that a lot of the people on the left don't understand, is the rich are actually paying more than their fair share already. Even though they try to, do tax shelters and all that stuff, still they're paying the majority of taxes. They figure the top 20% pay like 80+% of the actual taxes, and the top 30 actually pay almost 100% of all the taxes. So already the rich are paying their taxes. But under a UBI system, what you have is you get this basic income that's provided to all people. Everyone, rich or poor, doesn't matter. They all get this $10,000, or roughly $12,000 if it's 1,000 per month. And what happens is you use this money to replace welfare. Now, welfare is actually a very expensive and very wasteful system. Because what happens is you have like different groups within welfare. There's like food stamps, and there's housing, and there's all these different programs within the welfare system. And they all compete and they all do weird things. And the money gets kind of wasted half the time and gets allocated incorrectly. With a UBI system, the idea is that you give $10,000, or I'm rounding it to 10,000. You give that money to people, and they can decide how they want to use it. Do they use it on food? Do they use it on housing? They decide how it's used. And so all these other welfare systems are completely done away with. You just remove them. And a lot of the cost of the UBI system is actually, it's actually, savings that you get from removing all these other welfare systems. The welfare system is huge. I mean, it does take a lot of money to implement, but still the cost of UBI is well above. I think it's like several times above what the current welfare system is. I think in the US they spend about $1 trillion on welfare, 1 to 2 trillion actually, I should say, and UBI would cost about 4 trillion. So there is that situation where it is more expensive. Now the question is, would it work? And the problem is, and I see a couple major problems. One is government. Generally, a UBI system is trying to reduce government, and that's something I'm very pro in many ways because it removes this whole welfare system within the government. However, governments are not very good at removing government systems. Like they're generally when something gets developed, it gets added on to the existing system, and all the old legacy systems just stay there and just it just becomes bigger and bigger. Governments are very good at getting big. They're not very good at getting small. So generally, that's the first obstacle. Just implementing the UBI is getting rid of all that government government waste. It's really hard to remove that. And generally, what happens is those groups that are in there, those other welfare groups, are going to lobby. They're going to prevent the UBI from coming in because they're going to want to maintain their jobs. So that's implementation is brutal, just to get beyond that bureaucracy, that entrenched bureaucracy of the welfare system. Now, to make things worse, what'll happen is when they lobby these groups, and this will happen, is they'll say, well, that 10,000 that people would get through UBI, well, how about if they get sick? How about if they live in a big city? Or how about why give it to the rich? And there's going to be all these exceptions. Or what if they have like some permanent illness or disability? And those exceptions will make people say, well, the UBI is not fair. And what happens is, so all those exceptions become like sort of like the situation where people will be like, hey, these people have to be taken care of. That's the whole point of a UBI. You have to take care of everybody. And there's going to be a whole bunch of situations where people are going to say, well, these people are not being taken care of. And people will say, well, we have to adjust it. And where do you even come up with the number? Like I suggested like 1,000 per month, but generally what happens, and it's sort of like when people come up with this whole concept of poverty. What is poverty? And it's actually a made up number. The thing that I heard was the poverty rate is usually based on you take the average of what people earn, and it's, let's say people on average earn $1 million, and then if you're in the bottom 10% of that group, then you are impoverished. So so it doesn't look at the fact that, hey, everyone's earning $1 million and you're just poor in comparison. It looks at just being where are you in that group? You're at the bottom 10%, well, then you're poor. And it doesn't actually compare that to, well, hey, maybe other areas you'd be considered super rich just to be in that bottom 10%. So that's generally what people use for poverty rate, which is this kind of arbitrary calculation. And when you have an arbitrary calculation, what ends up happening is that number gets determined. So you'd have a whole ministry that would get involved in the government, and they would say, well, UBI is 1,000 this year, but we realize that it's not the right number. So we gotta look into that number, maybe adjust it, and there's always going to be this tendency with governments to grow, and it's just a government thing. They love to grow, and they love to help people, and the more they help people, the more they grow. It's like, so they would come in and start administrating and coming up with that precise number. Now, if you think about it, it's sort of similar to socialism. Socialism, and this is socialism, but it's a different form of socialism. Socialism when it comes to the free market. Now, the free market, if you read Adam Smith, which is you really have to read Adam Smith, he talks about the invisible hand. That within the free market, you have this invisible hand that determines the prices of things. People, there's so many interactions that happen within the free market. There's nobody that can come in and say, well, this is what the price should be. This is how much demand there is. There's nobody that can do that because there's just too many interactions to calculate it all. And what happens with socialism is you have what's called central planning. Now, central planning tries to determine the needs and the wants of the whole society. And that's what UBI does. It tries to determine this is how much people need. Well, that's not really, it could be very arbitrary because people are individuals. They're very different. I could survive on maybe like 5,000 a month, whereas somebody else can maybe survive on $100 a month. It's totally different what people see as being amount of money that they would need to survive. And their needs are different, their demands are different, what they want to buy with that money is different. So there's a lot of things. And what happens is when you create a system where you determine what those needs are, and the UBI, even though it's supposed to be just money that is put out there, it's still trying to, in order to determine how much money there needs to be put out, you have to make that central planning decision that this is what you need. And then what happens is you get just a whole mess because there's, people in a city would need different than somebody living in a country. People in a family will need something different than what an individual will need. There's a whole bunch of differences that would make determining that number impossible. And even though you say it's universal, it doesn't work that way. We're not all the same. So it would never work, first of all. Now, that's looking at it from like a purely like realistic kind of situation where we say, oh, how do you implement UBI in this current environment? The government being what it is, the situation with how governments manage things. Let's take the ideal. Let's say, it magically wave a wand and UBI is implemented. All welfare is removed. Okay, great. Now it's been all welfare is removed. And what happens is everybody gets the 10,000 check in the mail and they're happy. Like, we got this $10,000. Now the question is, what does that do? And let's remove all administration. Sorry, I should mention all the things are removed. The most ideal form of UBI. Everybody gets a check in the mail, no arguments, nothing. It's just a check in the mail. There's no extra government. All that administration is removed. This is the ideal situation of UBI. Okay, so whether that's realistic, not a concern at this point. So what happens is everybody gets this money in the mail. And what do? They, spend it or save it or, do whatever they want with it, right? It's their money. Now, if they spend it, everybody gets this free money. In a way, it's free money in terms of the way people would interpret it. They didn't have to earn it. They didn't have to go out and do anything additional. People that paid lots of taxes would say, well, this is a tax rebate. That's the way they would see it. But majority of people would see it as just free money. And when people get something free, a very good example of this is like I used to live near a small town called Escazoni. And Escazoni, I didn't live in Escazoni because I wasn't allowed to live there. I'm not an Indian. I'm not native. When I was a kid, everyone called them Indians. So even they called themselves Indians. So just so you know, I'm being politically incorrect, but I never know what the political correct term is for them, for the groups that live there. They were Micmacs. So just so you know. So these Micmacs, natives, they money from the government, and they would get free housing. They would get free a whole bunch of stuff. They would get, actually, it was pretty amazing. You'd see these houses that were totally falling apart with big satellite dishes. It was every single one of those houses had satellite dishes. It was the craziest thing. So they all had these really amazing satellite dishes, and then their houses were falling apart. And generally, the reason for that was they didn't care. they, they didn't care that their house was falling apart. And the reason they didn't care was they got it for free. The house was for free. They don't care if it's maintained or not. If it falls apart completely, then they get a new house. And the reason they don't care about it is they didn't have to work for it. They didn't have to do anything to get that house. There was no hardship that they had to face in order to buy that house. And as a result, they just didn't appreciate what they had. People, when we work for something, and you put all that effort into it, like you actually appreciate the money that you earn, and you appreciate what you buy with that. Like if it takes you like years to save up and get that house that you always wanted, then you're going to treat that house with respect, and you're going to be really, really careful with it, because you know how hard you had to work to get that house. But when you get it for free, all of that is lost. And that's what happens first with UBI, that this money, it's free money. It's play money. You can do whatever you want with it. There's no respect there. There's no like, oh, I had to work hard to get this money. No, it's just free money. And that's the first big problem with UBI, is that people just don't respect what they're getting. The second problem with UBI is actually a little bit more insidious than the first, is what I've noticed, and this is a welfare issue. This is any time when you give somebody something for free. It's like teach a man to fish is always better than just giving him a fish. The problem is when you keep on giving that guy the fish, they never learn to fish. They're like, hey, give me that fish. Like, just keep on giving me, okay? And they never learn to do it on their own. They just assume that. I mean, if you stop giving them a fish, they'd be like, why didn't you give me my fish? I need my fish. And there's no appreciation there. And what happens is they've created a dependent where they don't see that they should go out and do something in order to earn that fish, to earn that money. And that is really insidious. And I've seen it. I lived that life where when I was growing up, I lived in an area that had 30% unemployment, and there was just a high percentage of people on welfare. And they would just want their government check. It was actually really sad. They'd get their government check, they'd go out, buy cigarettes and lottery tickets. It's the craziest thing. And that was actually very common. And it drove me crazy to see this, because I hate smoking and I hate lotteries. So I just saw it as a horrible thing. And what happened is like they just became dependents, and they could live off of very little, and they never wanted to work. And they actually tried to bring in companies. The government was really trying to be proactive and save this community that I lived in, and they bring in companies, and the workers would come out and they'd be like, okay, well, we don't have to work. Why do we have to work? We get free money anyways. And they would just come in. They would maybe come in, actually. Half of them wouldn't even show up for the work. And then the ones that did show up would be like doing everything half-assed. And, the business would be like, well, we can't run a company this way. These people are useless. And the people just would be like, I'm just here to collect a paycheck. They are not there to actually work. And it's because of the fact that they've been sort of brought up on the system of just getting free money. They don't even respect the fact that you have to earn that money. But beyond that, they don't even respect the concept of working. They've been so demoralized that they don't even respect the idea of working and earning something that is truly yours. It's so sad to see, like, a whole society like that. Now that's what UBI would create. It would create a society of dependence that would If you took the UBI and made it 10,000 and people became dependent on that, and you think, well, some of them will have to work because 10,000 really not that much to live on, you'd be amazed that people could live on that. They would find a way to live on that. Now, if you cut it down to 5,000, the funny thing is they would still find a way to live on 5,000 a month. They would complain a lot because they're expecting 10, but the point is they would find a way to live on the very minimal that you give them if they don't have to work. And when you create that mentality, it's so insidious that you create this mentality of not working, not having to earn your keep. It is so destructive. It's the saddest thing to see people like that. And I've experienced it as a child, and that was why I actually left my hometown. I tried to make a business there. I tried to actually started my business there. And I actually tried to work with local people, and I actually did hire local people, but it was just, they were useless. They just didn't have any entrepreneurial spirit. They didn't have a concept of work. It was useless. And I just was like, I can't do this. I have to leave. I have to, move my business. And and that's what I did. And then my business is very successful, but it's a sad thing to see. Like, you try to create opportunities for these people, but they're totally useless. And they probably know it themselves, but they don't care. And that's the problem with any of these kind of government assistance. That's why I hate welfare, but UBI is the same idea. Even though it's not what people call welfare, it's a set system of money in the mail. It has that negative effect. I mean, I've actually heard stories, and this is from my sister. She lives in Kuwait. Now, Kuwait is actually it's the extreme of UBI anyway. What you have is everyone in the country, every citizen of the country, and there's not that many citizens, is entitled to revenue from the oil industry. And it works out to being a huge amount. It's like 800,000 a year. It's like some crazy, there's not many citizens. It's like a very small country in terms of population, the actual citizen population. They have a lot of people that work for them. Like, Kuwaitis don't actually work. They actually, they bring in people to work and do the job. So Kuwaiti doesn't work. Very rare. So what happens is, like, you have all these Kuwaitis who are getting like huge amounts of money just to be alive, and they do insane things. Like, so I've heard stories where they get all this money and they buy a car and they trash it. They just run it into a pole. They don't care. And then they go out. They don't even do anything. They don't even go and say, hey, we should get this car fixed or something like that. No, they just buy another new car. And it's just that kind of mentality where they don't value anything because they're given such huge sums of money that they really don't value anything in their lives. And it's the extreme of UBI because it's like, factors of 10 higher in terms of how much money they're getting. But it just shows that money doesn't solve the problem. You'll still have all the social problems that you would have if you didn't have a UBI at all. These people are a mess. They have alcoholism, not alcoholism, but they do have problems that aren't being fixed by the fact that they're getting all this money, and they're becoming their dependence on the government, and that's the worst thing imaginable. So these are some of the things with UBI that I kind of want to address, but there's even more. The problem goes further with UBI. Now, UBI, what it does is it creates two groups. There's going to be a group that depend on UBI, and that's the people who just don't want to work, don't want to survive, don't want to do anything. And then there's going to be the group who has to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for it. It always works. So this is wealth redistribution. And if somebody tells you, oh, UBI is not wealth redistribution, it is a lie, because it's always, the money comes from somewhere. You have to take it from somewhere. Anything government is finite in terms of financing. Money comes from somewhere else. Okay, so if you get a dollar from the government, well, that means that that dollar was taken from somebody else, and always see that. And this real allocation of funds is a form of theft, um, and it has to be seen that what happens is you have two groups, and if one of those groups, the ones that are just receiving it and are benefiting from it, is bigger than the other group. So it's usually that's what happens. Like if you look at the welfare system in Canada or United States, the majority of Canadians, for example, like I think it's like 60% of Canadians, 60, not not six, 60 benefit from the government in terms of how much money that they pay and how much money they receive from the government. Now the other 40% are the ones that are paying for for those 60%. And so what ends up happening is the 60% will say, well, do you want more government? And 60% will say, well, I benefit from it. So they always vote for more and more government. Now the 40% are basically the slaves. They're the rich. They're the people that that have to pay for the other 60%. And when you get a system that is too skewed, where more and more people are receiving money from the government and less people are able to actually, that are used to actually pay for that money that they're receiving, what ends up happening is you have this weird skew where the people that are earning the money will just say, well, screw this. Why am I working for you? Why am I doing all the work? And, you're just getting all the benefit. It almost reminds me of the story of the red hen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the story of the red hen is like this hen is like got some little seeds. They is given some seeds and they plant the seeds and they say, well, can anyone help me plant these seeds? And nobody's like, I'm too busy. And so the little hen plants the seeds, and then the seeds grow into this wheat. And this hen is like, hey, can anyone help me gather the wheat? And everyone's like, no, you do it. Nobody wants to help. And then the red hen takes the wheat and grinds it up, but nobody helps her grinding it up. And then after it's all prepared and made into flour, the little red hen asks, hey, can anyone help me make it into bread? The very last thing you have to do. And nobody wants to help. But then once the bread is made, everybody comes. Everybody's like, oh, I'll help you eat it. I'll help you eat it. And that's what we have with our current system. The ones that actually work, that do all the production, are the ones that are feeding everybody else. And nobody appreciates them for it. But in the story of the red hen, at least, the little red hen's like, screw you, I'm going to eat the bread myself. And the hen eats the whole thing herself, which is pretty awesome. I like that story because it's a very good capitalism story. So yeah, I used to always read that to my children. You got to propagandize them when they're young. So yeah, so the point is, with UBI, you're going to get this situation where more and more people are going to become dependents on the government, and you're going to have like that whole mind shift where people become just totally useless, and more people will become useless, and the ones that work will become resentful of the ones that aren't working, and you'll get a shift between the two groups where eventually nobody wants to pay into the system. Nobody actually wants to keep it working. And the ones that are keeping it going they're just going to be so destroyed by it, where they no matter how hard they work, they just won't be able to keep up with the money that is required to keep the system going. I remember hearing stories like in Sweden when Sweden was a socialist country at one point where they were really pushing socialism. And one of the things that caused the collapse was that they were charging like 100% tax, like 100%, like you get nothing. And people were like, well, why work if I can't make any money? And people just gave up. People just stopped. Why, if I'm not going to get paid for what I do, why do it? and the system basically collapsed. So they actually revised the system in Sweden, where they really allowed the free market to prosper, and they actually removed even minimum wage. There's no minimum wage in Sweden. So a lot of people think, oh, Sweden is socialist now, but it really isn't. So it just shows that these kind of concepts of like UBI and all these kind of ideas where you think of like welfare systems helping people, often it really doesn't. It can really destroy people's minds. Now, what? So you're probably wondering, well, okay, so you're against UBI, you're against welfare, you're against all these things. What can we do? I mean, people do need help, and I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. Back in the '60s, there was actually a really interesting thing that they noticed. They noticed that as the society was becoming fairly advanced in terms of the U.S. In terms of like capitalism and production and just individual families were doing extremely well. The middle class was strong. U.S. was fairly well off during the 50s and 60s, early 60s. And what they noticed during that time period, there was strong community bonds. It was the whole family, nuclear family thing was very, very strong and very, very real. Um, and that was a very powerful time. And what happened was the government saw that they almost had wiped out poverty altogether. Poverty was almost non-existent. And so what the government said is we just want to put that last nail in the coffin of poverty. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a system called the welfare system. And we're going to help those people, that the last few people that are poor stop being poor. And they created a whole huge welfare system. They spent trillions of dollars on it. Okay. And the number didn't change. The same number of poor people exist back then and exist now. But they kept, and so people would say, well, you're just not spending enough. You just got to spend more, put more money into it. And it just kept on growing. And the more money that to put in, the less, they didn't even see any result. There was no benefit. And that's the first kind of story that I have to tell you. But what what happened before? If you look at the 60s and 50s and 40s, what people did was there was real strong communities. And when somebody couldn't afford something, like because everybody knew each other in terms of these communities, like there were real strong communities. I mean, not even like in small towns, but I mean big cities. There would be communities within those areas, those cities, where everybody would know each other. Everybody, they would go out, they would talk to their neighbors. There was a real sense of community. And the reason there was a strong sense of community was people were incentivized to have a strong sense of community because they couldn't rely on the government to give them money. They had to rely on each other. And that was it's a very different time period. Like, and we could go back to it, hopefully, like where we regain that sense of community, because I think it's really important. But what happened was they couldn't rely on the government. So they had to rely on their friends, and they had to rely on their family, and they had to rely on their community for help if they needed it. And people did help each other. Now, if you look at Asian countries, or if you look at places outside of Canada, United States, and Europe, you'll see that a lot of places, the community is still there, and they really do help each other. The young generation usually helps the old. And there's a lot of this community stuff that still exists where if somebody gets sick and they're like, well, I can't afford to get like surgery or whatever, the community comes in and actually raises the money for them, does like a fundraiser. It's like, things happen within the community to help that person. Now, within North America, what's happened is we said, well, we will rely on the government to decide who it helps. So basically, instead of taking the responsibility ourselves and to take care of our communities, what we do is we've shifted that responsibility to the government. And the government is horrible. It just doesn't know. It doesn't know your community. It doesn't know anything about the people in your area. So what it does is it says, well, we'll give money here and government money there. It might not even give it to the right person or people. So what happens is the money just gets allocated wherever the government determines it to be allocated. Again, this is planned economy versus invisible hand. Invisible hand would be like the community says, hey, this person needs help. There's a demand there. Let's meet that demand by, fundraising, by coming up with money, by donating to this person. And they will help that person. It's direct. Whereas a centrally planned thing, it's so disconnected from the people it's helping, it doesn't know how to allocate the resources properly. So if you really understand central planning, you'll see why welfare doesn't work. It's just a bad system. That's why you have to rely on individuals. Individuals can better sort out the thing and let the invisible hand of the free market help people, and it will help people. That's the amazing thing. You think, oh, you're just like these people, these poor people will just suffer and die. No, it doesn't happen that way. And actually what happens though is the communities become stronger, because if you know that you're at risk of never getting assistance when you need it, you're going to try to make better bonds with the people around you. You're going to try to have a much stronger community because it's in your best interest to have that. And everybody else in that community also has that same urgency where they need to rely on each other, and it creates a stronger bond. It's a healthier community. What we have now is just the opposite. We've broken down our communities, we've broken down our families, and we're relying on the government to basically take care of us. And it's a horrible system. Again, I see the mental the mental issues here, where it's really destroyed people's ability to connect with each other and to have a sense of community. And it's really important that we have those things. That's why I'm so strongly against government interference in these UBIs of welfare or whatever, because it's really taking that responsibility out of the community, out of the individuals, and giving it to somebody else to manage over you. And that's just not a good system. And I can give you even a more simple example of how people can rely on each other. Like my kids, when they're born, they're like, unable to do anything. They're just babies, right? They can't do anything. But I take care of them because they're my children. And there's actually a movement within Canada to have the government take care of children earlier, so that you can just rely on the government to nurture your child, daycare or whatever. And I see that as a horrible system, because again, it's taking that responsibility out of the parents and shifting it into the government. The government becomes the parent of the children. And they don't know how to raise my children better than I do. So what happens is, as I said, like with UBI or any of these kind of welfare systems, it's really, who do you trust more to help the people that you know? In the case of my children, I know my children better than anyone else. I know what they need. I know how to raise them best. I don't believe the government knows better than me when it is involved with taking care of my children. I don't want them to take care of my children. And that's the real problem with UBI, with any of these welfare systems, is we're shifting the responsibility from the individual to the government, and we're becoming all dependent on that government rather than each other to solve our problems. So there's one more thing I would like to express about UBI that really bothers me, is, again, with the concept, just quickly, this is one more thing. One problem with it is it's free money, right? So what ends up happening with free money is people don't necessarily save it. They just play with it. It just usually gets wasted, even by the individuals. They know best what they want to do with the money, but because they have no value there, they don't really spend it in the best way. And what ends up happening is a lot of people just waste the money. if you look at a lot of the ways people use welfare money, as I said, they buy lottery tickets and cigarettes. They don't really use it in the best way. And that's why actually Trump, for example, he would give those food baskets to people because people were just buying, like with their food stamps, they were buying like really stupid things and wasting the money. So because it was free, it's really the problem with free that causes the issue. If they actually earn that money, they'd probably use it more wisely. So the problem, okay, so this is one thing. You got to get this concept of that they don't appreciate what they have. But what ends up happening is this. Let's say like if I was earning money, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some aside just because like I never know if I'm always going to earn money. I might get sick or I might have some problems. So I want to put money aside just for a rainy day for really protecting myself in the future. And we do that to retire because we know that we can't work forever. So we retire, we prepare that money we put aside. And with the UBI, we've kind of taken that away because we're now thinking we're going to keep on getting these checks forever and ever. Okay. And what happens is that check will pay your basics, but it won't pay your emergency. So if you get sick or if you get something where you need some more significant expense, then UBI will not help you. And you're going to be in a situation where you have no resources and nobody is going to be willing to help you because everyone else is getting free money and they're not really, there's no community there. Okay. So what ends up happening is the system will like basically result in a lot of people dying or having problems with this healthcare expense or housing expense or some like emergency expense that they just couldn't foresee and that will potentially destroy that person. And what'll happen is the society will be like, well, we gotta change this UBI because it doesn't account for all these things, and then they'll ask for more and more protection from the government because they've only learned how to be protected by the government rather than relying on themselves. That's the big problem, that they never learn that, hey, I gotta survive on my own. The amazing thing, and I experienced this myself, was when I was growing up, my parents are actually fairly wealthy. They're both doctors. So, I could pretty much have whatever I wanted if I needed it. My parents were pretty stingy. That's a different issue. But I pretty much had anything I wanted. And but I never actually saw my parents as wealthy, strangely. It was the weirdest thing. I never saw them as wealthy. And I always felt guilty asking them for anything. So when I went to university, I just happened to be in a situation where I didn't want to ask my parents for money. That was, for me, taboo. I would just never do that. And I was in a situation where I had a roommate who just didn't pay them, or didn't pay their rent. And so the money that I was given from my parents did help me through university, so they were not that stingy. But all of a sudden, the money that they gave me wasn't enough to cover both my rent and this other person's rent because I was basically seen as the one that had to pay the rent. It was a messed up situation, but I ended up paying this other person's rent, and so I had no money. There was no money left for food. Now I could have said, "Hey, mom and dad, give me more money." No, I could have had that mentality, and that's typically what happens with these kind of government systems. We say, "Hey, government, give us more money, please. I need it for this emergency." But I didn't. And what I did was I was like, okay, I'm either going to sink or swim. And I got a job. I did the worst jobs you can imagine because that was all that was available. And I just worked and tried to earn enough in order to feed myself, in order to, cover my expenses. And I actually experienced that many times during my university career where I was basically poor. I didn't have enough money to eat even. And the only way I could, get enough money to eat was to do jobs and to do, to sell things. Like I had to sell some of the stuff that I loved just because, I needed the money. And, you know, I survived. And I didn't have to ask my parents for more money. I didn't have to go to them and say, oh, please, mommy and daddy, give me more money. No, I survived. And it's amazing, even somebody like me who was totally useless at that time. I was not the most useful person because I was very dependent on my parents. Once I took the responsibility and took care of myself, I learned so much, and I actually became more resilient. And it was something that I actually carried into my business. That there's been so many times where people have tried to destroy my business, and I was resilient because of the fact that I learned to adapt and learned to conquer any hardship that I faced. And it's just such an important lesson that you don't want to have this sense of dependency, relying on others. Rely on yourself and be that kind of person that can survive no matter how bad things get. It's a really important lesson to learn. And anytime we rely too much on the government or like a UBI system, we lose that. And it's a very sad thing to lose. And I want that to be clear. That's maybe the biggest reason why I don't like UBI. So yeah, so this has been my sort of rant or whatever about UBI, and I hope that some of these ideas come across and people can understand that I'm not just saying, oh, I hate UBI. I actually try to propose a reasonable solution to solving these problems, that we learn how to rely on ourselves, that we learn how to rely on each other, that we build communities, we build things that will actually protect everybody. And we don't necessarily have to protect people directly, where we say, oh, we're going to wrap you in bubble wrap and protect you for life. No, we don't have to do that. We have to let individuals be individuals and fend for themselves and be aware of our communities and kind of work to help our communities. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please give me your feedback. What do you think about UBI? Is it the best thing? Is welfare great? What do you think? How should we solve the world's problems? Please comment below. Talk to you later.